He showed up every morning at 5:30 a.m., always the first to arrive, always the last to leave. No one ever asked his name, and he never offered it. In the crowded streets of a bustling city, where everyone was rushing to chase their dreams, he seemed invisible, just another face in the blur. He wore the same worn-out jacket, carried the same dented lunchbox, and worked with a quiet dedication that no one really noticed. People passed him by, saw him sweeping sidewalks, scrubbing windows, or fixing pipes, but no one truly saw him. In a place where everyone is too busy to look twice, he became part of the background, reliable, unremarkable, and forgotten. But what no one knew was that behind his silence was a story, and soon something would happen that would force the world to stop and pay attention. He was known simply as the worker. No one asked where he came from or why he worked so hard, for so little. To most, he was just part of the machinery, the invisible force that kept things moving while everyone else looked the other way. He cleaned their mess, fixed what was broken, and never asked for anything in return. Yet behind his weathered face was a man with memories, losses, and hopes he never spoke of. Some whispered he might be from somewhere in Eastern Europe. Others guessed Latin America, but no one ever asked. His accent was thick, but his gestures were clear, hard-working, kind, disciplined. He greeted everyone with a nod, sometimes a small smile, and then quietly disappeared back into his tasks. Until one day something shifted, something small at first, almost unnoticeable, but powerful enough to begin unraveling everything. It started with a child. A little boy from a nearby apartment building dropped his toy car on the sidewalk, and without a second thought, the worker picked it up, wiped it off with the edge of his shirt, and handed it back with a gentle smile. The boy lit up. His mother, watching from the steps, noticed the man for the first time. The next day, she brought him a cup of coffee. Others began to notice too. The way he stopped traffic for an elderly woman to cross. The way he fixed a broken railing no one had complained about, simply because he saw it could hurt someone. Quiet acts of kindness that had been happening for years, suddenly seen for what they were: selfless, intentional, human. And in that slow awakening, the neighborhood began to realize that the man they had never noticed had been serving them in silence all along. But curiosity started to grow. Who was he? Why was he always there, always helping, never asking? Local journalist, intrigued by the whispered stories, approached him for an interview. At first, the worker declined, quietly shaking his head. But after some persistence and a promise to tell the story respectfully, he agreed. And as he sat on a bench under the same lamppost he cleaned every evening, his story began to unfold. He was once an engineer in his home country, a nation torn apart by conflict. He lost his home, his family scattered, and with nothing left, he came here, hoping to rebuild. His degrees didn't matter here. His past was irrelevant. So he swept streets, carried bricks, and fixed leaks. Not because he had to, but because he believed every job deserved dignity. His hands, calloused and rough, told a story of survival, humility, and purpose. And slowly, that story began to spread. The article was published online, titled "The Man We All Ignored." Within hours, it went viral. People began to come by just to thank him, to hear his story, to shake his hand. Strangers brought him food, offered him better work, even legal help. What had been invisible was now impossible to ignore. And yet, he remained the same, humble, quiet, always working. But something had changed in the community. They began to look differently at every worker, every janitor, every person they had once passed without a second glance. The immigrant worker, once a ghost in plain sight, had become a symbol, a reminder that behind every silent figure, there might be a story worth hearing, a soul worth knowing. And it all began not with a headline, but with a moment of kindness, and the courage to see someone others had missed for far too long. After the article went viral, something unexpected happened. The streets he used to walk unnoticed now echoed with greetings and gratitude. Children who once ran past him now waved excitedly. People who never made eye contact were now stopping him to talk. Some shared their own stories of immigration and struggle, realizing they had more in common with him than they thought. But for him, the attention was overwhelming. He didn't seek fame or praise. In fact, it made him slightly uncomfortable. He wasn't used to being seen. For so long, he had lived in the margins, blending into the background by choice. Now, the sudden spotlight felt like standing in the open without shelter. Still, he responded with grace, answering questions softly, offering smiles, and continuing to show up for work just like always. His humility only made people admire him more. The journalist who first interviewed him followed up with a video piece, a short documentary capturing his daily routine, his story, and the quiet dignity in his work. It showed him repairing a sidewalk in the rain, helping an elderly vendor, lift boxes patching a wall at a local school, all without being asked. The footage was powerful, not because of grand gestures, but because of how normal and yet how rare his acts of kindness were. The video spread fast. Schools invited him to speak. A local charity offered to sponsor his legal paperwork. Still, he remained grounded, waking at dawn, packing his simple lunch, and heading to work before the streets were even awake. It was as if recognition hadn't changed him, but it had changed them, and that, he believed, was enough. But while the neighborhood embraced him, there were questions lingering under the surface. Why did someone with his education and skills settle for manual labor? Why hadn't he tried to move up or seek better opportunities before? The answer, he explained one evening at a local town hall, was more complicated than anyone expected. When he first arrived in the country, he spoke almost no English. His engineering certifications weren't recognized. He applied for jobs, dozens, but was either ignored or turned away. With rent to pay and no network to support him, he took the first job that would pay cash. One job led to another. Months turned into years. He became the worker not because he lacked ambition, but because surviving in silence was the only path he could see. His story struck a nerve. It wasn't just about him anymore. It was about the countless invisible people who passed through the same struggles every day. People who left their homelands not out of choice, but out of necessity. People who sacrificed degrees, careers, even identities, just to survive in a foreign place. Through his voice, others began to speak up. A janitor at a nearby university admitted he had once been a math professor. A delivery driver revealed he was once a civil engineer. A cleaning lady said she had been a nurse. The immigrant worker had opened a door, not just for compassion, but for truth. Suddenly, the city wasn't just looking at him differently. They were seeing all the invisible workers and realizing just how many they had failed to notice. As weeks passed, the immigrant worker was no longer alone in his visibility. Others began to rise into view, a quiet revolution sparked by one man's simple honesty. Local businesses organized community appreciation days. Workshops were set up to help foreign-trained professionals navigate the complex maze of credential recognition. Language classes expanded their offerings, supported by donations from residents moved by the story. A high school even introduced a new elective called Lives Behind the Labels, where students interviewed local workers and documented their journeys. He continued his tasks, still mending, still sweeping, still fixing, but now with company. People began volunteering to help. Kids asked to learn basic carpentry from him. Retirees walked alongside him during his morning rounds. The community had changed, yes, but he hadn't lost himself in it. He still lived in the same modest apartment, to walk to work. Still sat alone during lunch, watching people pass by with a soft gaze and half smile. But when asked if he felt proud, he answered carefully. "I'm not proud because people finally saw me. I'm proud because they're seeing each other now." He believed his presence had simply reminded them of something they already knew, that kindness, no matter how quiet, creates ripples, and ripples can become waves. He didn't need to become a symbol. He was content being a seed, one that fell silently into the ground and sparked something real. But not everyone saw his rise with warmth. There were whispers, quiet resentment from those who believed he didn't deserve the attention. Online anonymous comments questioned his story, accused him of fabricating his past. Some claimed he was manipulating sympathy. A few even went further, suggesting he was part of a staged publicity stunt. These voices, though small, were loud enough to reach him. He didn't respond, but those close to him noticed a shift. He smiled less, worked faster, left earlier. The joy he had quietly carried now seemed buried under something heavier. The journalist who first shared his story reached out again. She offered to clear his name, to investigate the claims, but he declined. "Truth doesn't need defense," he said. "People believe what they're ready to see." Still, the community rallied around him. Neighbors left notes of encouragement. Local businesses displayed signs saying, "We see you." Students wrote him letters, sharing how his story changed the way they saw their own families. The noise of doubt was drowned by the chorus of support. And slowly, he began to return to himself, not because he fought the backlash, but because he refused to let it define him. In one small act, he taught a lesson many had forgotten, that dignity doesn't need applause, and goodness doesn't depend on approval. He didn't need to be famous, just useful. And in that simple goal, he remained powerful. One evening, the city council surprised him with an award, a certificate recognizing his extraordinary contributions to community, unity, and human dignity. The room stood in ovation as his name was called. Cameras flashed, officials clapped, and people cheered. But when he approached the podium, he didn't speak of himself. Instead, he used the moment to tell other stories. The woman who cleaned hospital floors after escaping war. The man who repaired bicycles while dreaming of teaching again. The boy who translated for his parents while still learning the language himself. He reminded everyone that behind every unnoticed worker, there's a world waiting to be heard. "I am not special," he said. "I'm just visible now." And in that moment, the immigrant worker became more than a symbol. He became a mirror, reflecting the parts of humanity we so often overlook. His story didn't end with the award or with the applause. It continued each day he showed up with his quiet strength, steady hands, and unwavering belief that every life holds value. The city never looked the same again. People paused. They noticed. They asked names, offered help, listened with new ears. And as the seasons changed, the immigrant worker remained a constant figure in the morning light. Not just cleaning the streets, but reminding everyone who passed by that sometimes the most extraordinary people are those we fail to see until we finally do. Months passed. The initial media storm faded, but something deeper had taken root. The immigrant worker's story had quietly reshaped the culture of the neighborhood. Schools kept inviting him, not for headlines, but because students listened to him like they didn't listen to anyone else. He never used complex words or flashy anecdotes. He simply told the truth. He spoke of sacrifice without bitterness, of work without shame, of loss without complaint. Two young people facing their own uphill climbs, his words weren't distant. They were grounding. He reminded them that dignity wasn't something the world gave. It was something you chose to carry. Eventually, universities reached out. Not to study him, but to learn from him. A local professor invited him to speak. In a sociology course, nervous, he hesitated, but agreed. He stood before a hall of students and began by holding up his hands. "These hands once designed bridges," he said. And then, for years, they scrubbed floors. Up, but they never stopped building. He spoke about systems that erase talent, about the quiet brilliance of overlooked workers, about how the label immigrant often hides far more than it reveals. The students didn't just listen, they leaned in. Some cried, some took furious notes. One later said, "That one talk taught me more than any textbook." But the immigrant worker never lost focus. While the world around him changed, he remained anchored to his routine. Every morning, the same streets. Every evening, the same quiet walk home. He wasn't chasing success, he was living purpose. Still, he began to recognize his influence, not as fame, but as responsibility. He started mentoring younger immigrants who had just arrived in the city. He taught them how to navigate daily life, how to stay safe, how to preserve their self. In a world that tried to ignore them, he reminded them, constantly, that their value didn't come from recognition. It came from how they treated others and how they endured. One young man from Eritrea freshly arrived with nothing but a backpack, later said, "He saved me without saying much. He looked at me like I mattered before anyone else ever did." Over time, the immigrant worker helped dozens find jobs, connect with housing, even learn English. He never asked for thanks, and most people who received his help had no idea how much he had once lost himself. He carried every life he touched like a quiet promise not to fix the world, but to make the piece of it around him a little more human. And in doing so, he had become more than a worker. He had become a builder of hope. Years passed, the city kept evolving. New faces, new buildings, new noise. But if you passed by certain corners at sunrise, you'd still see him gray now. At the temples, slower in movement, but steady as ever. Time had etched lines on his face, but softened none of his presence. People still stopped him for advice, to share stories, to say thanks. Some took selfies. Others asked him to visit schools, churches, libraries. He remained humble, still choosing simplicity. But something else had changed. He had begun to write. Late at night, after work, in a small notebook at his kitchen table, he documented everything, not for fame, but for memory. He called the notebook Things I Saw While No One Was Looking. It was a mix of sketches, poems, stories of people he'd met, thoughts on injustice, and quiet reflections on kindness. A neighbor discovered it one day and convinced him to share it with a local publisher. Reluctantly, he agreed. The small collection was printed in limited copies. It wasn't a bestseller, but to those who read it, it was a revelation. Teachers used it in classrooms. Social workers used it in training. One reader wrote this: "Book changed how I see everyone around me." His quiet notebook had done what he always did, transform invisibility into humanity. One winter, the immigrant worker fell ill. Age and years of wear took their toll. For the first time in decades, the streets missed his footsteps. The community noticed immediately. Local shops hung signs that read, "Get well soon." Children drew cards. A fund was started to cover his hospital bills, and volunteers took over his usual tasks, sweeping the streets, repairing benches, watering flowers. But none could do it the way he did. They tried, but something was missing, not the skill, but the presence. His absence had become a silence the city didn't know how to fill. When he returned home, thinner but smiling, dozens gathered to greet him. He looked surprised, even moved. "You didn't forget," he whispered. "No," someone answered. "You taught us how to remember." From then on, the community didn't wait for heroes to be noticed. They noticed each other. They greeted the crossing guard by name. They thanked the bus driver. They asked the cleaner how their day was. The immigrant worker had left them with a gift far more powerful than charity or inspiration: awareness. Not just of him, but of everyone they'd once looked past. And in that awakening, a city found its heart again. One quiet man had made empathy contagious. He lived simply until the end. No grand house, no formal accolades. Just a man in a modest apartment with stories in his hands and wisdom in his silence. When he passed away peacefully, word spread fast. The city declared a day in his honor, not a holiday, but a day of recognition. On that day, schools paused lessons to teach about humility. Local news replayed his story. Strangers shared how his life had touched theirs. Murals were painted, benches engraved with his words, and a small garden was planted near the lamppost where he once sat. A plaque read, "He reminded us to see." And now, years later, his story continues, whispered between parents and children, written in school books, shared in community centers. The immigrant worker who once blended into the background is now part of the city's soul. But the true legacy wasn't in the honors. It was in the daily choices people made because of him, to look up, to ask names, to thank those who served silently. He didn't come to be a symbol. He came to survive. But in doing so with quiet dignity, he became more than anyone expected. Not a hero in the traditional sense, but something even more powerful. A reminder that even in a world that moves fast and forgets easily, compassion can still be louder than applause. If this story moved you even just a little, don't let it stop here. Share this video with someone who needs to be seen, someone who might be walking through life unnoticed. And if you've ever felt invisible yourself, know this, you matter. Your story matters. Subscribe for more stories that remind us what it means to be human.